Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Supply Chain School webinar on net zero and carbon offsetting. I'm going to be your host for today, James Cadman. I work for Action Sustainability, the people behind the Supply Chain School, and I'm going to take you through some of the pros and cons of net zero and carbon offsetting over the next 45 minutes or so. These are the topics I'm going to cover in the workshop. Why are we reducing carbon? That should be fairly self-explanatory for most of you, but just a very brief recap. What the target is, what our response has been to date and our progress, how we reduce carbon, and what we do with residual carbon, that carbon that you can't reduce and get rid of. So, why are we reducing carbon? As many of you will know, the Earth's temperature has gone up by about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. This has been proven with information from Antarctic ice cores to show the temperature rise. Very well established science behind that, and that's what's led to global warming. So it's risen a lot higher and a lot more quickly than it should do in normal circumstances. The outcomes, the impacts of that, you'll recognise many of these pictures, whether it's flooding, forest fires in Australia or north of the Arctic Circle, coral reef bleaching and shrinking of glaciers in places like Greenland, but also top right of your screen, one that I grabbed off the news 5 days ago, about temperatures in the Arctic Circle reaching phenomenally high record temperatures. Essentially, they shouldn't be at 30 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of change, but there's a lot of recognition as well of the impact that we're having and the fact that we need to take action to change that. So on to the first Kahoot poll. Does your organization have a carbon reduction strategy with targets? So that's the question. And the answers are simply yes, we've got one. Yes, we have, but there's no specific targets in it. No, or finally, I don't know, I'll go and ask. Okay, that's great. We've got the results there. So 21 out of you, so that's out of 38. So over half of you have got a carbon strategy. That's great. And then there's another section, 24%, about a quarter of you have got a target but no specific, got a strategy but no specific targets, and a couple of you are not sure. Okay, so that's a good result. Lots of you have got carbon reduction strategies. Wonderful. It's what I like to hear. So what is the target? What's the response been, and what's our progress to date? That's the next section. As many of you know, we have got a law in the UK, the Climate Change Act, that was updated last April 2019, such that now we've got a target to reduce our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. Prior to that, it had been an 80% reduction, but now we're looking to get down to net zero in the next 30 years. It's slightly differentiated depending on which part of the UK you're in, but overall it's net zero by 2050, taking into account some issues like the economy of Wales, for example, is very agriculturally dependent, so that's why they've got a slightly different target. Scotland has decided to be more ambitious and go a bit quicker, but also they've got more natural renewable energy resources at their disposal and maybe a bit more ambition, dare I say, so they're looking to go quicker than that. But that's the context in the UK. We're one of the few countries in the world that actually has a legally binding target around climate change emissions, and we're probably the only kind of major developed economy that has one as well. As you'll know, the Paris Climate Change Agreement that came out 4 years ago was the first real landmark piece of global agreement on reducing carbon emissions to keep them well below 2 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels, or ideally keep them down to 1.5 degrees warming above those levels. It's not legally binding, but each country has to contribute its method for achieving that, their nationally determined contributions. How are we going to achieve those reductions? Everyone was involved. The US have decided to go their own way with their current president, but at a federal level, they are still continuing to do a lot of good work on this, so all is not lost. But yes, it's a landmark piece of work, and every subsequent annual Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings, is building on this work. So what's the progress been in the UK? This graph shows you the grid intensity, the carbon intensity of the UK's national grid. So what you see on the horizontal x-axis is years, clearly, and on the y-axis, going up the left-hand side, you can see the intensity, carbon intensity per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. So that's denoted in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent generated. And you can see it's coming down steadily since 1990. So over the last 30 years, it's reduced by 2/3. But why? So the first big reason for that, it was the dash for gas in the 90s, moving away from coal predominantly and using more natural gas for our energy production. That's significantly brought the intensity down for the electricity that we use when we plug in. The second one was more recently with the investment in renewable energy. There's been a 5-fold increase in renewable energy since 2010. predominantly on and offshore wind, solar PV, but also biomass. And you can see that the trend has come down. So any of you who have ever used DEFRA's emission factors for calculating your carbon footprint, you'll be using this data, and it changes year to year as the grid mix shifts. And more recently, we've seen the grid intensity dropping a lot lower. So it's currently at about 300 grams per kilowatt hour produced. But with the sunny weather we've had recently, the fact that we've had less consumption with the lockdown, we've been able to produce coal-free grid electricity for 2 months or more. Now, continuing this will change as lockdown is eased and we go back to a normal way of working. But it gives us a signal as to the direction we can go in and the ambition that we've got to reduce our carbon. So one of the reports I read recently is that during this time we've reached grid emission factor of about 143 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. So the target is there, the goal is there. Okay, so back to Kahoot for the second poll. Do you know what net zero carbon means? Yes, maybe, no. Excellent. Okay, so 14 of you know what it means, so you can come and do the workshop for me, and then about half of you are maybe, which is why you're here, and the rest of you as well. So great, you're in the right place. Thank you. What does net zero carbon mean? There are many definitions out there. The one I've provided here, that it is a zero-sum balance between greenhouse gases emitted and the same amount offset or sequestered, is one way of saying that. Essentially, it's a balance. What you're getting down to net zero. You reduce your carbon emissions down to a point where you've still got some left over, and then you balance those with another mechanism to offset them or sequester them, and you've got a net zero emission overall. If you manage to emit no carbon whatsoever, you're at zero as well, but most organizations will be emitting carbon in some shape or form somewhere. It's synonymous with the term carbon neutral. Some people will say that they're slightly different. There's not a perfect consensus on this, but to all intents and purposes, it is synonymous with carbon neutral. There's a standard on carbon neutrality past 2060. Quite a few organizations use that. If you're interested in that, I'd go and search for it, and it gives you the structure of how you actually go about working towards carbon neutrality and how you demonstrate that. That's not a topic for this workshop today, but if you want to go and look at that, you can separately. And it's subtly different to the term climate neutral, which you might have heard of as well. Climate neutrality talks about the temperature outcome, or the change in the outcome on temperature, global warming, because of carbon emissions. And it can be said that the climate is neutral, where the carbon that is emitted against the carbon that is naturally taken up by plants and the oceans and other systems, the carbon cycle, they balance each other out. So there's no net change to the global warming. So, like many things in life, there's always a bit of contention. Not everybody agrees, and there are some potential issues or things that you need to be aware of with net zero and carbon neutrality. It's buyer beware in many circumstances. So, to be truly net zero, to be properly net zero, you need to consider everything that you do and have an effect on, either as yourself, your household, your organization. It's not just focusing purely on your own four walls. So you need to include or think about your upstream supply chain and your downstream value chain. Particularly in our sector, the vast majority of our carbon impacts can lie outside of our own organization. Between 80 and 99% of our carbon impacts could be in the supply chain and the value chain. So to say that you are carbon neutral without considering your value chain is a little bit misleading. Science-based targets use the terms net zero as well, because that's one of the things that we're looking to get towards, of course, with the Climate Change Act. So further on, if you're engaging with another organization and they say they're carbon neutral, as I've just mentioned a minute ago, is it only their scope 1 and 2 emissions, i.e. the stuff they directly control themselves and the electricity they consume, or are they also talking about their scope 3 emissions, their supply chain, materials, products, services that they buy in, and their downstream scope 3 emissions as well from the products that they sell on? Go in with your eyes open when you're engaging about that. And likewise, offsetting is often used as a way out of final emissions, but it should only be applied to residual greenhouse gas emissions, only after you've taken all the other actions possible to reduce your existing carbon. So it's right at the end of the carbon hierarchy, in terms of make sure you've reduced what you can, and then when you've done all of those, then think about offsetting. So how do we reduce carbon? What are the options to reduce that? Well, similar to the waste hierarchy that I'm sure you've all become aware of and are very familiar with, there's a carbon and energy hierarchy as well. It follows the same pattern. So first of all, don't use energy if you can avoid the need. Don't dig the trench if you don't have to. If you can lay the pipes above the ground rather than digging a trench, then do so. Reduce the amount that you do use. So that could be smarter design, it could be off-site production, using equipment that's more energy efficient, consuming less stuff, changing your behaviors to be more energy efficient and consuming less. Switching, using alternative sources of energy, renewables, lower carbon forms of energy and the materials as well. Embodied carbon is important in that piece. And then finally, offsetting the residual amount when all the other actions have been taken. Offsetting is not obligatory by any means, but it's a mechanism there to support organizations reduce the impact of their carbon. So to do that, you'll probably need a carbon reduction strategy. We talked about that earlier, hence my question. These are the 5 main steps for doing that, for delivering a carbon reduction strategy. You first of all need to understand what the scope is. What are you including in that? What are the boundaries? Which parts of your business are you including? Which activities within your organization? What's the base year you're looking at, the baseline to set your targets off? You then need to measure, go out and understand how much carbon you're emitting from energy bills, from fuel bills, from material bills of quantities and so on, and think about what you're going to do. Develop your strategy off the back of that when you've identified your hotspots. Pick on those areas where you think are most important for carbon, led by the evidence. Next, you need to reduce it, of course. Focus on those hotspots that you've identified and think about how you can reduce the carbon in those. What measures can you do? What activities can you put in place? And then when you've done all of that, think about offsetting your final residual carbon emissions where possible. And lastly, reporting. Now, some of that you might have to report for legal reasons, such as the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting regulations, or through ESOS or any other mechanism that you might have to report to. We do have a separate lunch and learn session similar to this on carbon reporting that you can attend if you want to. But telling the wider world for one reason or another is an important part of this. Okay, so I'm going to run quickly through some examples of the kinds of energy reduction, carbon reduction actions you can take. Using more efficient equipment and transport. So the lighting, the welfare cabins you might have, plant and equipment, the IT systems you have. Think about the vehicles you have. Are they as clean, in inverted commas, as they could be? There's some knock-on benefits as well if you move away from diesel engines in terms of the air quality and health benefits. To do that, you need to consider some of the infrastructure needs. If you're going to use EV vehicles, you're going to need charging points. So there's an investment in that as well, and making sure you've got the right land space for it. And then just thinking about alternative modes of transport. There's been a lot of articles in the press recently about the river barges that have been used on the Thames for various projects that are happening up and down London. It just makes sense. They are perfectly viable forms of transport for materials in and out. Much lower carbon, avoids all those vehicle movements on the roads and the associated congestion. Taking that more widely, green travel plans. The last few weeks, we've all had to work differently. We've all had to think about how we can telework and use Teams and Zoom and all various other formats and platforms. How can that be extended into our standard way of working? Moving on to materials, this goes right back to the heart of life cycle assessment and thinking about eco-design approaches. How can the stuff that we manufacture and we install be designed to be lower carbon and can be easier to maintain, easier to upgrade in the future? Can we just use less materials, as I said earlier? Can we just be leaner with the way that we work and the materials we consume? Different kinds of materials, different kinds of concrete, different materials outside of concrete, different steels, different metals, all kinds of different products that we can use that have got lower carbon impacts. And recycled content is part of that as well, making sure that that is part of the mix. When we do consume materials, make sure that we are reducing our waste, promoting circular economy. All these things go together, they all intertwine. Essentially, if you consume less stuff, you'll be emitting less carbon. Taking into account the in-use phase as well. So it's not just the construction and commissioning, but those people who are going to be the owner-occupiers later on and making their energy bills lower and their carbon emissions lower as a result of that. Off-site production as well, I've mentioned that, lower environmental impacts, but other things as well. Better efficiency, reduce safety risks, and so on. Okay, so you've got improving behaviours as well. You can have management systems and automatic sensors and switches, but also training your colleagues and your staff on how to use their equipment more efficiently, choosing the right piece of equipment, making sure they know how to use it, they don't leave things idling, sadly, that still happens a lot, and choosing the right power mode for the piece of equipment. Moving on to the power source themselves, so this is the switch part of the energy and carbon hierarchy, thinking about where you can put in renewables such as solar PV. You might have lighting rigs that can run off solar PV in the summer, or batteries that are they can be dual fueled through grid electric and solar panels as backup. So there's various different ways of doing this and blending the different kinds of pieces of equipment you've got and the opportunities to reduce the carbon emissions. And then finally, thinking about different business models being radically different, moving to a service model rather than ownership, for example, going remote rather than face-to-face. There's lots of different ways of doing this, and this is just a short list, and I'm sure there's many others that you could add to it as well that give you that blended approach to reducing your carbon. There's no one size fits all by any means. Okay. And yes, using carbon footprinting to measure that and understand what the improvement is, how well you've improved against your baseline. This is one example, the Cooperative Bank's headquarters up in the Northwest. When they redesigned their offices, their new offices, they very much took into account carbon, energy, water, waste in the design and the construction, and then the subsequent operation of the facility. And you can see in the first paragraph at the top, they looked at ways of reducing the need to consume energy by having natural lighting, natural ventilation throughout the building. And considering that, and you're bringing in here not just carbon and energy, you're bringing in here well-being and people's productivity as well. These things all follow on from each other. And then some of the technologies in the second paragraph: CHP for energy production, heat recovery from IT systems rather than bringing in new heat, energy efficient equipment, and water as well, grey water and rainwater. And then you can see the outcome at the bottom in terms of the reduction on carbon and energy that was achieved through that. So with the right planning and the right design, it's all achievable. Okay, so what do we do with the residual carbon? So we know about what net zero is. We know some of the methods of reducing carbon and the energy and carbon hierarchy. What do we do with what's left over? Okay, so the third of four polls now on Kahoot. What's your opinion of carbon offsetting? I'm giving you four options here. It can be a valid part of your carbon reduction strategy. I'm undecided, but interested. It's all a load of greenwash and shouldn't be allowed. And finally, I've never heard of it. That's why I'm here. Excellent. Okay, so the vast majority say it can be a valid, or sorry, just over half can say it can be a valid part of a carbon reduction strategy, and about a third of you are undecided, and 16% think it's all greenwash. Yes, that's a valid comment to make. Offsetting does carry the cross, I suppose, of being accused of being greenwash. And if used in the wrong way, it can be greenwash, certainly. There's lots of reports out there of offsetting programs that don't live up to their claims, and the way organizations use them is misleading, to say the least. So what I'm hopefully going to show you now is how you can use offsetting in a robust fashion that isn't greenwash, and gives you the credibility you need. So what does carbon offsetting mean? It's linked to the net zero piece I gave earlier, and it's about compensating for those greenhouse gas emissions that arise from an organization, or could be a product or a project in one place, through greenhouse gas avoidance, reduction or removal in another place. You do that by investing in projects that will lead to lower carbon emissions overall when compared to a business as usual situation. And that's one of the key tenets of carbon offsetting, that it's comparing it to a business as usual situation. It's investing in things that wouldn't have happened otherwise without that financial investment. Some of the benefits of carbon offsetting: it applies the polluter pays principle and gives a level of responsibility to the emitter, gives them a reason to be responsible for what they're doing. It helps investment in some of those projects that elsewhere wouldn't otherwise have got the investment to go ahead. Some of these projects just wouldn't happen, and that's the business as usual, the additionality piece that I'm going to come on to in a minute. But it's not just about carbon. Many of these also lead to better air quality outcomes, improved social and health outcomes, employment, as well as biodiversity gains as well, improvements in nature and biodiversity. So it's not just about carbon. And if you have a carbon reduction strategy and you're looking to get to net zero, it can be that final piece in the puzzle for you to achieve that. once you've done all the other actions that I was talking about earlier. So what does good offsetting look like? There's 4 key areas, and people will place these in slightly different orders, and they might use slightly different words, but essentially, for it to be robust and avoid the accusation of greenwashing, it needs to be real. And there have been offsetting schemes that aren't real, and to be real, they need to be verifiable and traceable. Can they be traced back to a particular location, a particular organization, and can you verify that they are actually about offsetting? They need to be additional. And that means that they're going above and beyond business as usual. If a project was going to happen anyway, because it was going to get government funding from somewhere, it's not additional. The test, and when you get into the schemes, they will test for additionality to understand, is this investment allowing this project to go ahead? And if it didn't get the investment, would it not go ahead? So it has to be additional. Measurable is clearly part of that. You need to understand how much carbon you're avoiding or reducing. Just saying that you've planted a few trees is not enough. You need to be able to measure what you're doing. And importantly, they need to be permanent. It can't be something that happens and then gets removed after a couple of years. It's got to be permanent over a decent length of time for it to have an effect. So I've arranged these in the mnemonic of RAMP, R-A-M-P, and you'll see some others put it in a different order, but RAMP works for me in terms of remembering what is needed for a robust offsetting scheme. And then to allow the actual project to work, it needs to be backed by a mechanism or a program that is independent. They've got no vested interests. They're not biased. They don't have a profit share gain out of it. They are transparent with robust governance. You can see how they invest and where they invest the money. They need to be inclusive. They need to make sure that certain communities are not excluded from this. It's not just about carbon, as I say. There are other impacts as well. This is wider sustainable development. And importantly, you need to avoid double counting, avoiding that carbon emission being counted more than once, or that carbon reduction. Some examples of carbon offsetting projects: using renewable energy, installing wind or solar is one way of doing that. So you can avoid or switch your carbon emissions to a lower source or a zero source away from fossil fuels. Reduction is a very common one. One of the prevalent ones is methane capture, whether that's off the back of a landfill site or anaerobic digestion or some other agricultural source, and converting it into CO2, you're reducing your greenhouse gas emission. Installing efficient appliances is another good example, and there's many out there where it's providing low energy light bulbs in developing countries, for example, or efficient cook stoves in developing countries where they'd otherwise be using dirtier fuels that are more carbon intensive. They give off bad air quality emissions and so on, as long as they're additional. And then the most commonly known one, of course, is through the planting of trees, reforestation and afforestation, to plant trees on a long-term basis to ensure that carbon is captured. And the final one there, CCS, carbon capture and storage, is a high-tech version of what a tree does, essentially, just with lots of pipes to capture the carbon. So, but there are many, many different projects out there. And some of the practicalities of understanding what a carbon offset does, it's comparing the emissions that you are getting through a project, investing through a project, and that's the orange line, the lower line in the graph, against what business as usual would have been had you not invested that money. How are you lowering those emissions by a more efficient appliance or converting methane to carbon dioxide, whatever the benefit might be, and then calculating what those emissions add up to, that reduction. That's what the yellow shape there is in the graph, how they can actually calculate what those reductions are. And then for every ton of carbon dioxide avoided or reduced, it equates to 1 carbon credit or 1 carbon offset in the language of offsetting. So how much does offsetting cost? It can vary. It depends on where you go for your offsets. It depends on what kind of project you invest in. But just here are a few examples, and you can see it's not all that expensive. $10 per ton of carbon dioxide offset isn't that much, and that's for things like renewables, solar power, and so on. And you can go higher to something like $25 for a reforestation program per ton, and prices can go higher than that if they need to. And just to give you an explanation of where those numbers come from, so it's all to do with how much it costs to do that program, that offsetting project, versus how much carbon is saved or reduced or avoided. So if you've got $1 million cost and you're reducing your carbon by 100,000 tons, it's essentially $10 per ton. Likewise, if you're, for the same $1 million investment, you're only reducing 50,000 tons of carbon, it's $20 per ton. So it's a cost benefit analysis, basically, on simple terms. But then it's there for the organization to think about which kind of investment they want to go for and what kind of projects they want to support. In terms of actual offsetting itself, there's two main options. There's the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, backed by the UN and governments, country governments who are party to the Kyoto Protocol. There's a public registry database of the projects and the credits. It's all out in the public domain. Their governance is very clear about who validates a project and who calculates and verifies those emissions. It's limited to developing nations because it's not just about carbon, it's about sustainable development as well. The social benefits, the employment benefits, the better health outcomes that I mentioned earlier. And then the last piece there is that the offsets are called certified emission reductions. Bit of jargon, CERs there. The second main option are voluntary schemes, and there's lots of them out there, and this is where the buyer does need to beware, and this is where the greenwashing accusation comes in the most. They are run by private organisations, and they can be international, they could be at a national level or even a regional level. There are lots of them. I've picked out three of the main ones here that are generally accepted as being robust and good quality. As I say, not all are equal. Do check for the projects about additionality, measurability and permanence within them. The three there, the gold standard, the verified carbon standard and Plan Vivo, are three of the most well known. They are very similar in their kind of the way they look compared to the clean development mechanism on the outside, but there are some differences within. In terms of being all publicly disclosed, they do have the option, or project owners do have the option, to not disclose publicly if they don't want to. So there's something there. The validation of projects and the verification of the emission reductions is done in parallel rather than by separate parties. And their projects can be anywhere in the world, developing countries or developed countries. So there's a difference there. And then in the jargon they use to name their carbon offset credits, verified emission reductions, voluntary carbon units, and other names of a similar meaning. So there are some differences there. So, like buying anything in life, you need to go in with your eyes open and understand what the differences are, what the pros and cons are. But the main thing, as I keep stressing, in terms of the concern about greenwash, is making sure you have that carbon reduction strategy, and offsetting is not just seen as an easy way out, that you've done all that you can first of all with reduction before you go to offsetting. And then if you do choose to do offsetting, that you do it with a robust mechanism, a robust program. So back to the carbon reduction strategy, just to remind you of that. Yeah, it's making sure that you've got all those steps in place, and then offsetting is only coming in finally at the end when you've done everything else that you can, and that you are transparent about it, and the organisation you use is likewise transparent. So, fourth and final Kahoot poll: what's your next action on carbon? Having heard a little bit more about net zero and carbon offsetting, I'd just like to get your opinion on what you're going to do next. You're going to find out about your organisation's carbon strategy. Are you going to go out and measure your carbon footprint? Could you consider investing in lower carbon products and services? Or is it all a bit much and we're going to turn off the lights and go home? Excellent. So none of you have given up. Wonderful. Hopefully that's a good outcome. And yeah, a good spread about different actions. Thank you for taking part in the poll. That's really helpful, really interesting. I think there's a lot that organisations can do. It's not something that's for one person or even one department to do. It's for the whole organisation. Everyone within an organisation has an impact on carbon and the wider sustainability impacts as well. It's not just down to the HSE or the sustainability manager to manage and deliver. Everyone has their part to play. I think that is the final slides. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.